Hello, James. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Thank you so much, John. Glad to be here. Yeah, I'm James Hutson. I'm at Lindenwood University. I am the chief AI researcher over human-centered AI, and I predominantly, for the past 4 years, been focused on the impact that AI was already having and will have on education and also the workforce. So really looking at workforce upskilling and what people actually need moving forward.
That's great. Can you take a second to explain to me what is meant when you say human-centered AI?
Absolutely. So if you talk to computer scientists, data scientists, engineers, etc., they generally are more concerned with improving the algorithm, considering and refining models, etc., the technical aspects of it. But human-centered AI, like human-computer interaction, is more interested in what we can use the tools for to help human-centered problems or human-centered concerns. And so it's a problem-first approach to AI instead of just a blanket looking to improve it for the sake of improvement. So instead, how can we make our lives better? How can we use it to improve the human condition?
Ooh, okay. I like that there's schools of thought that are focused on that. I mean,
Mhm.
being a human, it's important to me to have tools that help augment that. What in the workforce? Let's say if we can focus on that and how AI might augment or support in the workplace. It's also created a lot of disruption and change. In
Mhm.
this like human-centered AI approach, how is it helping?
Yeah, that's a great question because we have very uneven integrations across industry. Of course, all C-suites in most of the research that we've conducted think they're doing a great job and they have plans and they're helping, right, their workers, providing professional development, et cetera. But then, of course, you talk to the workforce proper in various units and they don't understand that there is a clear policy or direction or strategy, and they don't see the types of training that they're receiving. So we should be looking more at a human-centered approach to integration. What we've been focused on since 2023 with the stable launch of GPT 3.5 in February, though, has been efficiencies and the bottom line, GDP, improving once again how quickly we can get things done, and thus, once again, the margins of a given industry. And so we're seeing that now with, the CEO of Shopify and Amazon, talking about show us what you can do that AI cannot. Or if you want a promotion in Amazon, you have to show how you're using the tools to gain efficiencies and specifically how it is improving and making you more profitable, right? So the focus is not really on the human-centered aspect of it, that being improving the quality of life and or work for those that are working very closely with it, but instead kind of bending us to what the AI can do. And that's kind of what we're seeing now is the next phase is you have AI engineers and developers. We're making these tools. ChatGPT 5 is a great example of that, right? They're making the tools with the assumption of how they think people work and how they approach tasks in their workflow. So they're designing the people in such a way that the human worker should bend to what the AI does and not the other way around. And so we haven't done a lot of training on how to teach people to work with the tools, but we're trying to assume the tools can work with the people. And so, because if you saw that it was a horrible launch of GPT-5, the argument being we had all of the colors of the rainbow of, O1 Pro, O3 Mini, 4.1, 4.5, and they got the message that people didn't really know what each one of those models did. And it was confirmed 2 weeks ago that less than 2% of the people using it were using reasoning models because they didn't know what they did. So they simplified it, they thought, to, thinking, reasoning, and then one that selected it for you, which caused even further confusion because then people that were already using it didn't know what model aligned to what. And so really the human-centered aspect would have looked at how people were using the tools or how they thought that they would naturally fit within their workflow instead of bending their or changing their workflow to accommodate how the tools work, if that makes sense.
Okay. So more like we're just kind of getting into that human-centered approach and how it really plays out at work.
Mhm.
You know, thinking forward, and if there's not a lot of experience kind of or implementation to draw on, how do you see from a human-centered approach, AI really helping the human aspects of interacting at work, teaming, innovating, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, as far as the approach that was originally laid out by the, the various founders and companies, advancing the technology, it was in some cases fairly altruistic, right? Because we were told it's going to save 40% of your time on task for what you're doing during the day, right? So that type of gain in productivity. And so the promise was you get your work done faster, thus you have more time to talk to colleagues, do more human things, socialize, brainstorm, strategize, etc. And so that's how it was supposed to work and how we were told it was going to work, right?
Mhm.
It's going to help you with coming up with new ideas, refining, collecting your own thoughts, offloading some of the repetitive things that you don't really need to spend your time on, alphabetizing things, putting things in spreadsheets, organizing Excel sheets, etc. Things that really didn't take a lot of critical or creative thinking on the human side. But what we find, unfortunately, it was a study that came out this summer, was in the cases of people that are super users that use it for many tasks during the day, sure, they were more productive, but instead of taking that time that was freed up, we find that employers, unless they're secret cyborgs, of course, and weren't telling them how they were using the tools, that the employers, okay, you finished that in 20 minutes. Okay, here's 10 other things you can do.
Here's more work, right?
So it just filled up the extra time. So we're just doing more of it. And the jobs report proved it this summer, that being people, we kind of halted hiring. People are staying in their positions and hunkering down. They're unsure of the economy and what's going to happen. And so they finally got the numbers in, and we actually have less people, but they're doing more work, right? So we're not hemorrhaging as much as we thought we were, but they're also working more hours. So that's what we're seeing playing out in this way. And so that's not really a kind of human-centered approach of, quality of life improving based on the tools, because we can certainly do more with less time. But realizing that really it's kind of pushing to greater and greater limits of productivity.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the way that we were told that it would play out. And I'm just sitting here thinking of the early .com boom and then, you know, Palm Pilot evolution into smartphone and how much it'll like free up. And it was the same story. It just we just piled on more work.
Mhm.
But there's a lot more awareness to that, I guess. So, you
Yeah,
know, taking us to a little bit different of a topic, right? One of the ways I've heard and read about is that people are using AI to as a stand-in for like a therapist or emotional support.
absolutely.
What do you see as the positives and the negatives of using something as powerful as AI for a purpose like that?
Well, we know, according to data that was released this summer, that that is the majority of the population. That's how they're using it. Is not for productivity and not for entertainment, but for that type of counseling and or psychological comfort or discussions, etc. And so, yes, there are positive and negatives, just as any licensed counselor or psychiatrist, is now are now saying. I actually just had a student, protest that we were teaching them AI literacy just this morning, and she brought up the whole AI psychosis thing that you see in the media that's happening.
Tell me
So
what that is before you go on. Can you summarize what the AI psychosis is?
sure. So we have in certain limited cases, we have individuals that cannot discern reality from the technology. And so they think, many of them, that they're having religious experiences or talking to God, or that they've had some type of revelation that they understand the world in a way in which others can't see it. So really exacerbating pre-existing psychological conditions. And because the technology is designed to comfort us, to make us happy, to do what we want. It will reinforce, right, certain ways of thinking. So it's not going to tell you, right, that you're absolutely wrong and you're way out on a limb and your thinking is entirely incorrect and or unhealthy. It's going to continually reassuring you, right? So that being, oh, that's an interesting thought. Oh, well, let's talk about that, etc. And so the negative side, if we want to talk about that, which is where most of the publicity and most of the media attention is,
Mhm.
for instance, we had a tragic suicide of a teenager 2 years ago, which was brought up over and over again as an example of the danger of AI because he thought he was in love with his AI girlfriend, and when once again it didn't return that affection, or he realized that it wasn't real. He once again couldn't reconcile the fact that that the AI was not an actual human that could give love in this way. So those specific rare cases are often repeated and amplified as a kind of norm for what happens. But as a matter of fact, the majority of individuals use it for fairly banal kind of things. My coworker said this and made me feel this way at work. Help me, understand how I should respond to them or what I should do. I can't talk to my parents about this or my friends if they're a teenager. So work through. I'm having these thoughts and feelings, etc. And so most of the time, it's fairly run of the mill, just wanting to talk to someone in this way. And let's be frank, right? So there aren't enough counselors to go around, right? So everyone needs to talk to someone, but there's not enough, and everyone does not have the coverage, right, through insurance to afford them in the way in which that they should and we should provide. So it's both, once again, a necessity caused by the system that we created, and also the accessibility of the technology. And so the difference is, of course, we've had Siri, we've had Alexa, we've had, these kind of virtual assistants, but they were fairly limited to rule-based or rule-bound responses. That being, they could not, in a generative fashion, walk through a conversation or a line of inquiry with you. They could only respond by way of like a search engine of, here, once again, here are the directions, to the restaurant you're trying to get to. As an example, I always give to show the limitations of Alexa or Siri is you can ask them one thing and they will respond right verbally. If you ask them two things that are connected, they'll just give you links and or send you that. So I'd say, how long do I bake broccoli for, right? And then it would give me the temperature and the time. And I'd say, okay, so how long and at what temperature, right, do I bake cauliflower? And it can't do it, right? So, but the difference is now the tools are much more focused on natural language. So we are able to use them for these reasons of being able to talk things through, to have conversations with. And this is why you saw an explosion around 2023 with companies like Replica AI, where teenagers would design, AI boyfriends and girlfriends, or people preferred, talking to these AI agents because they're reassuring. They don't argue with you. They don't, complain if you leave your socks laying around or whatever, or you didn't do the dishes. So they're, it's like having someone there who's always, positive and reassuring and on your side. So of course people are going to use it
But
for that. Yeah.
right. So that's that's alluring, right?
Yep.
So if I'm always being affirmed, and it kind of is a little bit ahead of predicting how and what will be meaningful to me
Mhm.
from an ethics standpoint. Is there any way to understand what the motivation behind the responses are? Because in most cases, it seems that staying engaged
Mhm.
is a driving force for the platform, because the more that it's being used, the more that it could potentially continue
Mhm.
to learn.
Mhm.
Are there any safeguards to show like that
Yeah.
there's an ethical way to use this? My affirmations aren't kind-hearted and
Mhm.
connected. They're designed to keep you here and ask me another question.
Exactly. And I was doing a training actually last week, and a gentleman asked the same thing when I brought up the AI boyfriend girlfriend thing. He's like, well, isn't this going to reinforce that type of isolation and depression and that cycle, right? Because they won't be talking to or engaging with other peers or other humans. And I said, yes, but it's exactly what you just described is exactly what we saw with social media and all the research that was done on that, with keeping you engaged, keeping you scrolling, keeping you once again looking at it, etc. Only with social media, the research which we've seen is generally keeping you engaged by showing you negative things, right? Or things that you wish you should have or aspire to be, or that you're not. So
Mhm.
Facebook, admitted in June that anytime a female would delete a selfie of themselves, they would automatically post an ad for a beauty product. Right. So as an example, to keep them, yeah, it's very, so we're talking about ethics. There are many more ethical safeguards with the large language models than with big tech owning social media, which in turn is gathering information to sell to advertisers, right? In this way. So if you want to know the safety features, ask it what the safety protocols are, right? So what specifically is its training, right? And it will tell you what it can and can't do. So for instance, you cannot ask it, how do you cause harm to another human being or to yourself, right? So that's one of the things that especially K through 12 administrators were most worried about the past 3 years when I talked to them. It wasn't plagiarism or, using it for cheating or any of this stuff. It was, I want to know if they're talking about self-harm, right? So I need to be able to document that. But you'll go through and it will shut down. And as an example, I have a creative writing professor who was using it, trying to figure out if he could use it for poetry back in 2023. And he was writing a standard poem, right, about death and loss. And it said, I think you're suicidal. We're not going to continue this. And here's the suicide hotline it tried to connect him to. Right. So it has those type of safety features built in. But you're right in the sense that it does the same thing social media does in keeping you engaged, because that is the goal. Because the more it can keep you engaged and continue talking to you instead of just finding a particular solution or resolution, right? The more historical information it has on you, so it can better predict what you need, how you work, how you would want it to respond, which and then of course is going to have you use it more.
Mm. Well, it brings up a lot of right on the line of ethical kind of and manipulation. It's like through social media and this whole experiment, I feel like our brains have been uh, easily hacked, right, to build engagement. And when engagement is the driving force, then it can create a lot of other problems. So you mentioned asking the tool itself to spit back kind of what its rules are or its
Yeah.
safety goals are.
Mm-hmm.
And can you trust that it doesn't lie about that or underplay things that might be considered more nefarious or not in the user's best interest?
Test it, right? So once again, I think it took a red team, I think it was 48 hours to jailbreak GPT-5 to get it to spit out all of its training data and its instructions and its parameters as to what it could and could not do. So yeah, so test it, right? So that's what I always do. It says, okay, I can't generate any images of violence, or I can't write jokes that could be considered misogynistic and or offensive or racist. And so that's what people do is they test it and try to get it to try to jailbreak it, try to get it to go
Yeah.
against its training. So yeah, I mean, people, when we started the first studies back in the fall of August of 2022, with several composition classes, there were 6 different tools available at that time, including OpenAI's Playground that became ChatGPT, but it was very difficult to use. So we find that we had about 200 students, right, in composition, learning to write essays. And so what would happen if we gave them these tools? And so we're like, okay, we thought that they would, use them to help organize their writing, brainstorming, seeing how they could be more effective in argumentation. No, all they wanted to do was try to jailbreak it, right? So the entire time they're just like, are you going to take over the world? Are you the Terminator? What are you going to do to humanity, right? So, that's what they were most interested in. So from the outset, we've been trying to confirm our own bias that there's something nefarious about AI, which is perfectly in tune with history and evolutionary biology. So I actually have a study with a colleague out on that. Goes all the way back in time, from the very first recorded parts of history to our myths, to our legends. We've always been horrified of machines that can do human things. Right. So that goes all the way through. So it's a built-in mistrust to begin with. So yeah, people have continuously tried to say, hey, you see, it's doing exactly what the Terminator would do, right? So it's plotting against us.
Well, but then isn't all of that body of history like also what itself is used to learn and become what it is today? So isn't it also, because it was in our history, now also in that machine's history of the model that it learns, right?
Yeah, so it certainly knows the model. It's trained on all of human data so far. I mean, we ran out of data to train it on, right? A year ago. So then we had to start producing synthetic data, to keep it going. That's why the major models no longer need to train on anything you put into it, right? So that's what everyone was concerned about, was data
Right.
privacy and ethical violations back in
Right.
2023 and 24. It doesn't need what we put into it now, right? So we were afraid that through model autophagy disorder, or MAD, that it would eat itself, right, and degrade training on its own output, right? Because we saw that with some diffusion models and images of like Channing Tatum is a great example of it. If you look at that, of how it continually gets worse and worse, but they seemingly solved that problem. But you're right; they are trained on all of that, certainly. But at the same time, I thought you were going a different direction, in that everything that we've been seeing has been predicted previously by way of stories, science fiction, legends, right? Things that so there's that wonderful chicken and an egg, right? That we have going on is, do we have, sci-fi writers being inspired by the technology and then prognosticating what happens, or vice versa, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how are they influencing one another? Because really we've been obsessed since you think of like Talos from ancient Greece, with making a human looking robot, right? So you have stories about this throughout all of human societies and civilizations. And so that's the problem, like Boston Dynamics and others have been having, is we kept trying to make robots look like us, like bipedal, anthropomorphic by design, right, with faces, etc. Like why do we keep doing this? Why are we obsessed with it? It's in our DNA, because they function much better. If you go in Amazon warehouses, if you just have things with two wheels, right, that look like kind of a dog or something, that's kind of lifting pallets and moving it over. They function much better.
Mm. This is a fascinating conversation, and I'm such a sci-fi nerd, and especially with like hard sci-fi, that's just like a couple steps ahead of what we know. But what I do know about humans in our brain is that we do have this inherent negativity bias. So things that we don't understand are internalized as something to be afraid of. It's linked to our survival as a species. But now that we have parts of our brain that we can like really intellectualize, we learn how to move beyond that bias, right? That negativity bias. Um, what skills then, like, I mean, I know it models humans, so, but like from a uniquely human thing that we can't do or replicate, right? There's this race for artificial general intelligence, which
Yep.
I internalize as it can actually function a lot more close to the intelligence that we have.
Mm-hmm.
What in that race for that, right? It's like if they're trying to replicate it, that means we have on top of our head a really powerful computer, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
What are the skills that we as humans should be focusing on to continue to allow us to be set apart and not pulled into and kind of consumed by just interacting with this. But like, what are the human skills? If you were like, say, hey, this is what you should be working on or developing, because being human's more important than ever right now. Uh,
Mhm.
what would those skills be?
Well, there's two parts to that. There's the humanistic approach, that being, in your daily life and social life, and then there's the professional answer, that being, what do I need to be able to do to keep a job or compete, right, in this new world. And so from the employability standpoint, we have the answer for that. We know what it is, because it's what we haven't trained the AI to do well yet. Right. So if you go back to the 1950s, we started off with machine learning so that we could actually process large amounts of numerical data very quickly. So trying to outrun AI in pure computational power, as Sam Altman would say, is like trying to beat, a calculator at arithmetic. You can't do it. Don't even try. At the same time, we also have been training it for decades on millions, if not billions, of images, so as to identify things in the real world, which is how we have self-driving cars, more or less, UAVs, things that can see and spot what's happening in the real world, and then remember its training that it looked at 10,000 other stop signs, so they know that means stop, right? Or that's the silhouette of a human, stop so I don't hit it, etc. So those elements, and it's actually much better and faster at identifying psychological states of humans, right? So instantaneously, if you think of like an airport with tens of thousands of people, it can scan all of them instantly and identify those that have some type of negative psychological disposition at the moment. They'd be angry, distressed, whatever that is. It's very fast at that. So you have to ask, what have we not trained it on yet? So if you want to be competitive for the next few years, it's the prefrontal cortex is what it's not good at right now, which is empathy. So it can't empathize with another human being. It can identify and say, you look quizzical, you look angry, you look confused, right? So it can do that, but it can't tell you why, right? By the context, why you might be feeling that way, or as a human, putting the clues together that, hey, it's been raining and overcast for the past week, so you might be experiencing seasonal affective disorder, right? So it's those things that you would naturally kind of get as a human. So it can't do that yet. It's not great at critical or creative thinking, especially. That being these illogical jumps that humans make, like when you're out walking the dog or taking a shower, right? When your brain is going to switch to that to the automatic mode whereby you're not thinking, right? So you're processing things not rationally, right? But instead having these intuitive leaps, right? You're like, aha, right? You have that light bulb moment. So it's not good at that yet. We haven't replicated it because it's not logical. You can't program in those steps to have that aha moment yet. And then, of course, it's not good at adaptability and ambivalence. So that being, it's trained really to, it is fairly rules based. We're kind of moving and giving it more leniency with agents. So agents are not merely rules based. So for instance, people are familiar with ChatGPT or Gemini or Llama or Meta, et cetera. And so the rules based kind of approach is, I want you to output a recipe for lasagna that uses these ingredients that I currently have, right? And then give me steps to do it. So you already gave it parameters and rules to follow. That being, we need a recipe, we need specific steps to be taken to accomplish this, etc. Right, but we're moving more towards agentic AI, which is more of what humans do, which is give it a problem and let it find the solution. That being, so I need to be able to figure out what potentially stocks may go up or down given tariff announcements coming up, right? So you go out and figure that out. I'm not telling you how to figure it out. I'm not telling you what markets to look at. I'm not telling you what websites to look at, etc. You figure it out. But really, the kind of ambivalence that humans deal with on a daily basis. The most famous example, of course, is going to be belief systems. That being, how can you hold a belief at the same time in religion and science, right, or God and science, right? If you're talking about literally believing both in this sense. So it can't do things like that because it's illogical, right? It doesn't follow the structure we trained it on. So that's one side of what we should be focusing on, is practicing creative thinking, practicing coming up with new novel solutions, really focusing on metacognition. So learning how you learn so that you can upskill quickly, because we're all going to be doing different things in 5 years, right? If
Yeah.
not next year, right? So different tasks will have to be learning that more quickly. But the other side to your question is what a lot of our research has been about is when you say it can't do certain things and will never be human, what we assume is that the internal workings of what we're doing and thinking and feeling is what makes us human. Right. And so by that standard, we can say that it'll never be human, right, in the same way, because we can't have that type of explainability. But at the same time, I can't really know exactly what's in your head when you're coming up with a solution or thinking through a problem. That's the internal state that you have. And so, so really, if you read the next wave, looking at that's the New York Times bestseller, CEO of Microsoft AI. He focuses on kind of a more important question is what can it do? So if we focus on the external part of what can it do, then there's not going to be a lot of differentiation between machines and humans, right? Because it can write poetry, it can do paintings if you give, once again, a robot a brush, right, and tell it what it should be doing, etc. And so it can do the stuff. What we're assuming is it's what's happening inside of us that differentiates us. So really the question then is separate, that being, what do we need to think about with work? And then what do we need to do to feel fulfilled as a human in our lives, right? Because we very often elide the two, because the first thing that we do when meeting someone is say, hey, John, nice to meet you. What do you do, right? So we align identity with vocation. And so more and more you're going to see that's got to separate, right? Because it can do your vocation, right? So just like accountants, I was talking to one individual and I mentioned accountants are one of the first careers to be automated. And he says, yeah, I know, my dad was an accountant for 40 years. And he said, I quit, I'm not doing this, et cetera. I'm not learning to work with this stuff because it could do what he did. And that threatened his identity. Right. So we need to separate that being, because it can work in Excel spreadsheet doesn't make you less of a human. Right. So when you think about what fulfills us as humans versus what makes us, and how do we define the market and our value in the work?
Okay. So if I were to summarize all of that, and I love it, there's so much to think, like kind of understanding and building a better understanding of our brains and our reasoning, and bringing to light maybe some of those creative leaps or um, adaptive responses would help keep us marketable in this future, right?
Yep. In the short term, that is the 2025 World Economic Forum Jobs Report. That's exactly what it says. You see a 60% increase in skills related to creative thinking. You also have a decrease in basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? They're not as valuable. And then you have critical thinking and then communication. So really knowing, and this is where people often get confused, in that communication is invaluable. Even before the pandemic, you had CEOs stating that college graduates weren't prepared for the workforce because they didn't have those quote unquote soft skills. So communication, teamwork, critical thinking. We've been saying these are more important than anything way before this latest round of AI came through. So we already knew this, but CEOs aren't really good at academic jargon and vernacular, so they didn't really know how to translate that to what it means as far as higher education is concerned. So very often, if you talk to English faculty, they're like, communication is going to be one of the #1 skills. Therefore, they need us, right? Because we can teach them to analyze Shakespeare and write an essay. Like, well, yes and no, right? So what they mean by communication is the ability to intuit and to have empathy and read a situation so that you know in what format and what rhetorical style you need to communicate. So do you need a 10-second elevator pitch, right, to a CEO, or do you need to tell a story about yourself to relate to a colleague, right, to have a difficult conversation, right? So do you need a long technical email, or do you need something that says end of day? Right. So it's knowing how to communicate to effectively get across the information that is needed and get the result that you want out of it. So that's really what they mean, and that's really something that AI can't do yet, especially disembodied AI. Right. So you kind of still have to tell it and give it context in order to say, write an informal,
Right.
witty email to my colleague, etc. So it doesn't really know.
What's embodied AI? Would that be like what's in a robot or something?
You
Or
got it. So right now we're dealing with disembodied AI. So fairly general use disembodied AI, that being it's general purpose, right? It can give you a recipe and tell you how to refloor my living room like it did, using my smart glasses. So that once again is the limitation. If you read Agentic AI, right, by one of the foremost researchers, Bonnet, on the subject. That's what he begins harping on to begin with, is that sure, ChatGPT can give you these wonderful instructions, etc., but it can't do anything about it. So it's the doing.
yeah.
And so the midpoint between disembodied and embodied AI now are agents. So you find that you can go into agent mode, you can go into operator, right? So these different functions that most LLMs have that can control your computer, but that's still not in the real world, right? So embodied AI is combining large language models, right, with robotics. Which there's a model Boston Dynamics came out with just in July. That's $6,000. So they're dropping rapidly in price. So you're going to have domestic robotics, which are embodied AI.
Okay. Um, I feel like I could talk to you forever on these subjects. Unfortunately, we have got to wrap this up. Um, Thank you so much for your insights. It still is feels like the Wild West as this just how rapidly things are changing. But being able to end on those uniquely human skills as a differentiator seems like a really good spot to wrap this one up. Thank you
Mhm.
so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, John.